Leo Kane was an unregistered resident of the Maples. At first glance, the complex was indistinguishable from any other aging, university-owned housing on the East Coast. Electrical conduits snaked across the brick facades, bundled together beneath balconies. The paint, once a cheerful cream, had faded to a dispirited gray. 6 stories high with no elevator, the building's metal entry door was rusted and plastered with faded flyers. Inside, the stair heights were inconsistent, and the motion sensor lights were fickle, refusing to activate on cold nights no matter how hard one stomped, leaving the stairwell in pitch blackness. The peculiarity of this residential block was its designation as faculty housing for the university. Professors could live here for a fraction of the market rate, with significant discounts on purchasing. Within these unassuming walls resided hundreds of academics. An old man doing his morning stretches by the overgrown hedges might have been a foundational figure in his field, a pioneer of a bygone era. Leo lived in this den of intellectual giants, yet he was neither a professor nor a family member. He was 26, a doctoral candidate in literature with a future that felt increasingly uncertain. Last semester, his senior and newly minted professor had received a visiting scholar invitation for a year abroad. His apartment, 302 in Building 2, was a prime spot, south-facing, overlooking the greenest part of the complex and far from the main road. The 3rd floor was a perfect compromise, high enough to deter pests but not so high as to make the climb a grueling ordeal. Unwilling to give it up, he paid the rent for the year to hold the unit. Leo, meanwhile, had a falling out with his roommate and was desperate for a new place on a graduate student's budget. It was a perfect, albeit illicit, arrangement. They made a verbal agreement for a sublet. Leo would transfer the rent to his senior each month. It was a Cambridge-quality apartment for a Somerville price, a bargain he couldn't pass up. Soon after, his old classmate Chloe needed a place after starting a job in the city, and with her contribution, the rent dropped to a level that felt almost laughably low. Leo had arrived with his suitcase, full of hope that the scholarly atmosphere might spark some inspiration for his dissertation. That hope was quickly extinguished. Less than a month after moving in, he received the second-round feedback from the Journal of Foreign Literary Studies. It was a top-tier publication in his field. His paper had been sent back once before with 4 pages of scathing revisions. The anonymous reviewer had been astonishingly thorough, dissecting his citations and arguments page by page, questioning his logic, and delivering a final, crushing blow. The paper's thesis offered zero innovation. Not little innovation, but zero. After the initial rejection, Leo had spent months in a frenzy of revisions, burning the midnight oil, only to receive another email. His hand trembled as he scrolled down. He read the words, "We regret to inform you," and slammed his phone face down on the desk, letting his head thud against the wood. His abilities had always hovered around the level of mid-tier journals and conference papers. Aiming for this publication was a stretch, but his advisor insisted. Now, half a year was gone, and he had nothing to show for it. His advisor, Dr. Harmon, already had a long list of publications. What he craved were publications in A-list journals to bolster his own prestige. He pushed all his students to submit to top-tier outlets, regardless of their work's quality. It was a numbers game that cost him nothing but wasted months of his students' lives. Leo knew he lacked the ambition to become a star in academia. He just wanted to graduate. If this dragged on until he had to delay his defense, all the headbanging in the world wouldn't help. His phone began to vibrate incessantly. It was Dr. Harmon. At 45, Harmon was young for a full professor, but he carried the entitled air of a much older man. The grad students in his lab secretly referred to him as the warden. A text message informed Leo that the application materials for the Distinguished Professor title, a new honorific for humanities scholars, needed to be compiled and sent over before the end of fall break. The university was finally trying to bolster its humanities departments, and Harmon, Leo thought with a sigh, was as delusional about his own chances as he was about Leo's paper. The position was reserved for deans and department heads, not a mid-career professor with a modest record. It was another exercise in futility, with Leo doing all the work. He felt his fingers tighten around his phone. When it came to his students' research, Harmon was a ghost, unreachable for weeks. But when he needed something for his own career, he became a relentless taskmaster. Leo knew he should be reading, but Harmon's deadline meant sleepless nights. And it was due right after the holiday. He took a deep breath, suppressing the urge to type out a furious reply, and instead politely asked if the deadline could be extended by 2 days. The response was immediate, stating that Harmon would be busy after the break and needed to review it early. Leo stared at the screen for a long moment before replying with a terse okay and a thumbs-up emoji. He was a 26-year-old in failing health, who needed sleep. Anyway, taking the opportunity, he quickly typed another message, asking if his paper on Shakespearean adaptation might be a better fit for the university's own press. Dr. Harmon's reply was swift and cutting, chastising him for aiming low and lacking ambition. He was to revise it again and try for another top-tier journal. Leo took a deep breath, telling himself this wasn't self-pity but self-awareness. He was drowning in administrative tasks on top of his own research. As a graduate assistant, a position that paid a meager $2,700 a month, he was supposed to choose one track: research, teaching, or administration. He was paid for one but did the work of all three. He managed departmental zawul, from prospective student interviews to scholarship committees. He wrote lecture slides for Dr. Harmon and even managed the 3 different academic blogs Harmon had started in a fit of self-promotion. He sighed, opening the Notes app on his phone and adding another item to his overwhelming to-do list. Today, he decided he would head to the library. He grabbed his messenger bag and wheeled his bike out of the building. The university had recently installed a new gate system, requiring a student ID to enter campus. He balanced on one foot, swiped his card, and then sped down the main path. The ginkgo trees lining the road were a brilliant yellow-green, their leaves beginning to fall. He parked his bike outside the humanities building to upload a new promotional video for the department's welcome screen. The system was old, requiring a physical connection. As he was leaving, he ran into the department administrator, who nodded at him. He inserted his USB drive, replaced the old video with the new one produced by the student union, and paused before deleting the old file. The thumbnail showed a smiling couple, the department's sweethearts from his sophomore year. They had long since had a bitter breakup. So much for young love. With his task complete, he walked outside and saw the hulking brick building of the mathematics department nearby. A glance at his watch told him the next class was starting in 5 minutes. Students were hopping off their bikes and streaming into the building. Among them, a tall figure stood out. He wore a pale gray suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and narrow waist. He walked slower than the students rushing past him, an island of calm in a river of youthful anxiety. A pang of longing and heartache struck Leo. He remembered the first day of the semester when, unable to find a seat in the library, he had sought refuge in an empty math classroom to work on Harmon's materials. He'd had a cold and was wearing a mask, and the effort of typing 2 words made him feel drowsy. He fell asleep at a desk. He drifted in a shallow, anxious sleep until a low, magnetic voice cut through the haze. The voice spoke of how, in most disciplines, human knowledge was a series of approximations, with each generation overturning the last. Only mathematics, the voice explained, was cumulative, with each generation adding a new story to the structure built by its predecessors. Leo opened his eyes. The classroom was now full of students, all looking towards the front. His gaze followed theirs to the lectern, where a tall man stood. He seemed surprisingly young for a professor. He had a high-bridged nose, and sunlight from the window cast one side of his face in shadow, sharpening the line of his jaw. The muscles of his chest were visible even through his suit jacket. He looked less like a mathematician and more like a boxer. But his voice was calm and resonant, carrying the refined grace of a scholar. As the professor turned to write an equation on the whiteboard, the sleeves of his white shirt, rolled up to the elbows, revealed strong forearms. His fingers were long and elegant, the veins on the back of his hand standing out as he gripped the chalk. It was in that moment that Leo's long-dormant romantic heart, buried under academic stress and cynicism, began to stir. Ever since, he would often find an excuse to walk past the mathematics building, hoping for a glimpse. If time allowed, he'd put on a mask and slip into the back of the lecture hall. But it was always from a distance. He'd never spoken a single word to him. His heart had been pounding for weeks for a professor who had never even looked his way. The thought filled him with a fresh wave of despair. No academic breakthrough, a slave-driving advisor, and a non-existent love life. Was this how his PhD was going to end? The cawing of a crow overhead seemed to mock him. His phone buzzed again with a new message. There was no time for self-pity. Work had to be done. He spent the rest of the day in the library, revising his paper, and returned home after closing to work on Harmon's application until he collapsed onto his desk sometime in the early morning. He woke to a horrifying screech. It was a sharp, grating sound, like fingernails dragging across metal. Goosebumps erupted on his arms as he shot up from his chair. Before he could catch his breath, the sound came again, and again, a barrage of auditory torture that made his head split. It felt like someone was drilling into his skull with a steel wire. He clutched his head, recognizing the sound as a violin, coming from the apartment next door. It was the middle of fall break. Who would be practicing the violin at this hour? Filled with a righteous fury, he grabbed his phone. His senior had added him to the building's group chat. He found the user for apartment 301 and sent a private message. The violin scraped on for another 5 agonizing minutes before pausing. A notification appeared. His friend request had been accepted. He typed out a message explaining that it was a holiday and people were resting, and kindly asked if they could practice somewhere else. He felt his tone was polite, a reasonable first step. The reply came quickly. The neighbor replied that it was their private residence and their personal freedom to practice. Leo frowned. What kind of attitude was that? He typed back that private domains still had to adhere to public decency. The building wasn't a solo residence, and the noise was disturbing. The neighbor then asked how he could call someone's music noise. Leo shot up, his anger flaring. Music? Did this person not have ears? Before he could reply, the resident of 301 posted in the main group chat, asking if anyone else heard a sound from the 3rd floor. Leo stared at the screen, baffled by this self-sabotaging move. Then, residents from the 2nd and 4th floors replied, saying they heard nothing. Leo was dumbfounded. Were they all deaf? A private message from his neighbor arrived. No one else hears any noise. You should look for the problem within yourself. Leo was livid. He furiously typed that it wasn't noise, it was a public nuisance, and if it continued, he would call the police. For a moment, there was no response, and the sound of the violin stopped. Leo breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the ordeal was over. Then, a new message appeared. It was a link. He clicked it and saw a photo of a sound level meter. A caption explained that for a noise complaint to be valid during the day, it had to exceed 55 decibels. The message advised him to perform a test before calling the police. Leo saw red. The residents of the Maples were supposed to be highly educated professors and their families. He couldn't believe someone so unreasonable lived here. Could they be an illegal subletter like him? The thought fueled his resolve. He argued that the volume wasn't the point. The sound was so grating it had nearly sent him into a panic attack. The neighbor replied with a question. What was he talking about? They followed up with a photo of several trash bags sitting outside a door, pointing out that the building rules clearly stated no garbage was to be left in the hallways. Leo recognized the bags as his and Chloe's. They'd been too busy to take them out. The neighbor then sent a zoomed-in photo, asking why he hadn't sorted his recycling. Leo was bewildered. His argument suddenly derailed into a debate about waste management. He insisted that he had separated food waste from other trash. The neighbor countered that chicken bones were not compostable, glass bottles were recyclable but mirrors were not, and paper towels were not recyclable. They asked if he had any common sense. Leo was stunned. Why was this person so obsessed with his trash? He accused them of being a creep for inspecting his garbage so closely. The neighbor retorted that when they presented facts, Leo resorted to personal attacks. The rage in Leo's chest burned hotter. This person was clearly unhinged. He typed back that, in this day and age, anyone who separates their trash into two categories is an environmental champion. He told the person, who clearly had no ear for music, to stop polluting the airwaves and go saw a log instead. The next reply made him freeze. It was a single sentence that detonated in his mind like a bomb, shattering his composure. The neighbor had looked at his profile picture and commented that it was no wonder he was so illogical, given his love for Shakespeare. Leo's mind went blank. He leaped up from his bed with a roar, depriving him of sleep, insulting his character, questioning his hygiene. All of that was tolerable. But to insult Shakespeare? That was a mortal sin. Shakespeare was his research subject, his spiritual guide. Anyone who spoke ill of the bard was his sworn enemy. He fired back that Shakespeare was the Zeus of Western literature, the soul of theater, and asked who the neighbor thought they were to criticize him. After a long pause, a lengthy paragraph appeared. The neighbor pointed out the anachronisms in Shakespeare's works, like King Lear being set in the 8th century BC but featuring medieval dukes and knights in armor. They argued that any third-rate novelist today would avoid such glaring errors. They went on to criticize the plot, calling Lear and Gloucester's tragic falls the result of contrived, unbelievable character actions that no reader could empathize with. Leo shot back that exaggeration and a departure from realism were the poetic hallmarks of Shakespearean drama, questioning if the neighbor had ever heard of holding a mirror up to nature. The neighbor seized on this, saying that Leo was admitting the plays were full of anachronisms and driven by illogical character behavior. An unnameable fire shot up Leo's throat. He paced his room, phone in hand, typing that it was absurd to critique a medieval play with 21st century realism. He composed a 1,000-word essay on characterization and symbolism in Shakespeare, but the neighbor relentlessly attacked the logical inconsistencies, pointing out contradictions between character statements and their established personalities. The line-by-line critique was eerily similar to the feedback from the journal reviewer, plunging Leo back into a state of academic dread. The neighbor accused him of literary bullying for placing a logically flawed author on a pedestal and refusing to allow criticism. Leo was about to explode. This person had trampled on his literary idol. He stormed out of his room, grabbed a feather duster from the living room, and marched to the front door, ready for a confrontation. But at the last moment, he stopped. He retreated, swinging the duster furiously at his own door. Chloe, eating breakfast in the living room, stared at him. She asked why he looked like a ruffled rooster. Leo pointed the duster at the door and declared that the monster next door had insulted his research subject. Chloe was baffled. Leo recounted the entire saga, starting with the violin. Chloe listened with a look of surprise, saying she hadn't heard any violin. Leo was dumbfounded. The sound was like a drill in his head. Chloe listened carefully and said that if she opened the door to his room, she could faintly hear it, but it was very quiet in the living room. Leo closed his bedroom door, and the sound diminished significantly. It seemed his bedroom wall was adjacent to the source of the noise, so he was the only one suffering. Chloe asked what he was going to do. He looked at the feathered duster in his hand and immediately put it down, admitting he couldn't win a physical fight. Besides, as an illegal tenant, he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. Chloe advised him to just endure it, pointing out that he had tolerated Dr. Harmon for 3 years. Defeated, Leo returned to his room. On his way, he told Chloe that from now on, they needed to buy black trash bags because the light-colored ones offered no privacy. Chloe looked confused, reminding him that he had been the one to buy a bulk pack of 10 rolls of the current blue bags. Leo agonized for a moment between his principles of frugality and his desire to thwart his nosy neighbor before sighing in resignation. A few dollars was still money. As he closed his door, Chloe called out, asking if he had changed the Wi-Fi password. He had forgotten to tell her after the university system prompted an update. He apologized and she waved it off, saying it was her who was borrowing his account. The university had extensive databases accessible only to current students. Though Chloe had graduated, she still followed linguistics journals, so Leo had given her his login. He asked if there was anything interesting in her field. Chloe, who had been listless a moment ago, immediately perked up. She mentioned a fascinating article in the latest issue of Linguistics about a whistled language used by shepherds in Turkey. They could communicate over distances of up to 5 miles. As he listened, Leo picked up his phone to send Chloe the new password, but the screen flickered and went dark. It had been doing that lately. He told Chloe, who was heading out for work, that he would send it once he got it restarted. Chloe expressed concern, suggesting he get it repaired. But repairs were expensive, and the phone, a 5-year-old hand-me-down from a high school friend, wasn't worth it. He plugged it in and it booted up. He sent the password and looked at his to-do list, deciding to ignore his neighbor for now. He had a mountain of work to do. But as soon as he sat at his desk, the violin started again, worse than before. The simmering rage inside him felt like an active volcano, and each screeching note was a nuclear bomb dropped into the caldera. He tried to work, but the sound was torture. He decided to escape to the library for the day. Surely the person wouldn't play all night. When he returned after dark, the apartment was quiet. But the moment he sat down, the violin began again, as if on cue. This was personal. Exhausted and emotionally raw, Leo felt his despair peak. He threw his bag on the floor and pulled out a stack of scratch paper. He paced his room, devising the most vile, insidious curse he could think of. The next morning, his neighbor woke up to a message sent at 2 a.m. It was a photo of a handwritten note with 3 lines of elegant, forceful script. May the dew, brushed with a raven's feather from an unwholesome fawn, drop on you. May all the charms of sycorax, toads, beetles, bats, light on you. May a southwest wind blow on you and blister you all over. By the end of fall break, Leo had finished Harmon's application, arranged the scholarship presentations, and revised his paper again. He slept for what felt like an eternity and woke up 3 pounds lighter. He stumbled into the living room and collapsed onto the sofa. No new messages from his neighbor. Perhaps the courtesy of his spiritual mentor Shakespeare had worked. A few minutes later, he heard footsteps in the hall. It was Chloe, returning from work. She was a tutor at an IELTS prep center, and holidays were her busiest season. Seeing Leo dozing on the couch, she felt a pang of envy. She asked if he had run into the neighbor. Leo shook his head, admitting that he had been so spooked, he now checked the hallway before leaving his own apartment. Chloe asked what his plans were now that he had a couple of days to breathe. Leo sat up straight, explaining his plan to review some complex geometry so he could ask the handsome math professor a question after his next lecture. It was his best strategy for making contact. Chloe looked at him as if he were terminally ill. She sighed, remarking on his tendency to fall hard for people who didn't even know he existed. Leo defended himself, claiming he was more mature now than he was in high school. Chloe was unconvinced, reminding him that he had already bought a used copy of the professor's recommended textbook and sat in on 2 of his classes. He countered that he had only attended one. The other was on a topic far beyond his comprehension. Chloe suggested he just go up and talk to the man instead of devising such elaborate schemes. Leo lamented that he couldn't just do that. He wasn't a math student. What if the professor realized he was just trying to hit on him? What if the professor wasn't even gay? The thought of potential rejection was paralyzing. Chloe shook her head, telling him not to let this one end as disastrously as the last time. Leo winced. Just then, a new message from Dr. Harmon popped up. The presentation for his upcoming lecture needed major revisions. Another message followed with several papers he needed Leo to peer review for a journal. The volcano in Leo's chest erupted. He hadn't even had 2 hours of rest. He gritted his teeth and opened his laptop, muttering under his breath, "Toads, beetles, bats." He spent the whole night redesigning Harmon's bland PowerPoint, and the next morning, just as the lecture was about to start, Harmon texted that he was stuck in traffic and needed Leo to go to the classroom, upload the presentation, and play an introductory video to stall for time. Leo wanted to wring his neck. He grabbed his messenger bag and raced to the lecture hall. As he was about to plug in his USB drive, he noticed another one already in the computer's port. It had a small sticky note attached. On it was written Math Department, Julian Croft. Leo froze. A wave of elation washed over him. This was it. The universe, after months of torment, was finally offering him a lifeline. The chant of toads, beetles, bats in his mind ceased. He started the video, and just as it finished, Dr. Harmon rushed in. Leo, clutching his prize, slipped out of the room, feeling a flicker of gratitude towards his advisor for the first time. Back in his apartment, he composed an email. "Professor Croft," he wrote, "I am a PhD student in the English department. I found a USB drive in the lecture hall that I believe is yours. I found your email on the math department's website. Please let me know when would be a convenient time for me to return it." He sent it, his heart pounding as if he were submitting to a journal again. Half an hour later, a reply came. It was astonishingly fast. The email was polite and concise. Professor Croft thanked him, explaining that the drive contained important files and he had been worried. He suggested meeting the next morning at 11:30 after his class. Leo read the email 3 times, hearing the professor's calm, resonant voice in his head. He immediately agreed. He was no longer just an anonymous face in the crowd. He was now the student who returned the USB drive. Humming to himself, he opened the papers Harmon had sent for peer review. As he began to read, a sense of unease crept over him. The moment he hit the return key to start a new paragraph, the screech of the violin next door started again. He clapped his hands over his ears. So much for the curse. He angrily messaged his neighbor, asking if they had nothing better to do on a Wednesday afternoon. The neighbor replied that Leo was also home on a Wednesday, so he must not be very busy either. Leo shot back that he had worked through the entire holiday and deserved a break, telling them not to punish others for their own musical incompetence. The neighbor asked if one had to be a genius to play music, explaining that learning anything is a process. Leo retorted that with their lack of talent, he would be neurologically damaged long before they became competent. The thought struck a painful chord within him. He often felt he had no real talent for academia himself, yet here he was, trapped on this path. The neighbor replied with a question that felt like a punch. "You must have had an easy time in school, didn't you?" They went on to say they had met many people like him at the university, people with high credentials who looked down on the efforts of others. Leo felt his breath catch. This person had not only insulted him, but had insulted the entire student body. He quickly blocked the number. He didn't want to see this person online or offline ever again. Just as his anger was about to boil over, a new email notification appeared. It was from Professor Croft. "See you tomorrow." Those 3 words were like cool water on a scorching day, washing away his frustration. The next day, Leo stood in front of his closet in despair. He tried on every combination of his meager wardrobe before settling on a simple white shirt and a windbreaker. He spent 15 minutes trying to style his hair with a can of expired hairspray he borrowed from Chloe, who told him it was a lost cause. The wind outside was ferocious. When he arrived at the rendezvous point, a quick glance at his reflection in a window confirmed her prediction. His hair was a chaotic mess. It was too late to fix it. He spotted Professor Croft standing near the entrance to the building and walked over, his voice a little too loud in his nervousness. "Good morning, Professor." Julian Croft looked at his hair, a chaotic sculpture of spikes and tufts, but made no comment. He simply gestured towards the cafeteria. Leo, trying to compensate for his appearance with impeccable manners, chose a few simple dishes and sat down. Normally, he ate quickly, a habit from his high school days. Today, he chewed every bite slowly, determined to stretch out this precious opportunity. He launched into a series of conversation starters he had prepared with the help of his friend Miles, who had also done his PhD at Princeton. He asked about campus legends and traditions. Julian's answers were all monosyllabic. Yes. No. The conversation died. As Leo wrestled with a green bean, Julian spoke, for the first time initiating a topic. He asked Leo if he had a toothache. Embarrassed, Leo explained he was just chewing thoroughly. After another long silence, Leo, desperate to salvage the situation, asked what the professor did for fun. Julian mentioned rock climbing and listening to music. When Leo asked what kind, Julian paused, his gaze seeming to look through him at something far away. Then he asked a strange question. He inquired about Leo's English name. Leo explained that while his full name was Samuel, everyone called him Sam. Julian simply nodded, and for the rest of the meal, he was silent. As they were leaving the cafeteria, Julian finally spoke again. "Are you full?" Leo nodded, and Julian gave a slight nod in return as if confirming a task was complete. Leo's heart sank. This was it. The end of the line. He couldn't think of any excuse for a future meeting. As he stood there dejectedly, he looked up and saw Julian watching him with a faint smile. Leo had never seen him smile before. It transformed his severe features, making him look bright and warm. "Good luck with your studies," Julian said, and turned to leave. That smile and those words kept Leo buoyant for the rest of the day. That evening, he recounted the entire lunch to Chloe, turning the brief, awkward meal into an epic saga. Chloe listened with a pained expression. She told him he was being extreme, putting the professor on a pedestal. She pointed out that he had done all the talking, and Julian asking for his name was likely just a polite, desperate attempt to make conversation. The argument deflated him a little, but the memory of the smile was enough. As he was putting away laundry on the balcony, he noticed 2 items of clothing that weren't his. They were huge, a size 190, far too large for Chloe. A quick assessment of the wind direction made his stomach drop. They must have blown over from his neighbor's balcony. Just when his day was going well, he had to deal with this person again. He took a photo of the clothes and messaged the number he had just blocked, asking if they were theirs. The reply was quick. Yes. The neighbor then said they would come over to get them. Leo panicked. He couldn't have them see his apartment. The doorbell rang. He froze, then crouched behind the door, as if he were a burglar caught in the act. Chloe came out of her room, asking what was going on. He shushed her, whispering that it was the neighbor. She looked at him, confused, asking why he was hiding. He explained that after their heated arguments, he was afraid the man might be seeking revenge. More importantly, their illegal sublet could be exposed. The bell rang again. After a moment of silence, a knock came. They waited, ears pressed to the door. Finally, Chloe whispered that he must be gone. Leo peered through the peephole, but a festive decoration from last Chinese New Year blocked his view. His phone buzzed. A message from the neighbor. "Why aren't you opening the door?" He typed back that he was in the bathroom, then immediately regretted it. He quickly added another message, telling them to go back and he'd leave the clothes outside their door later. They demanded to know when. He invented a lie, saying he was already washing them along with his own clothes that had fallen on the ground. The neighbor replied that one of the shirts was hand wash only. Flustered, Leo said he had just taken it out. The neighbor insisted they needed that specific shirt for the next day. "It's my Friday shirt," the message read. Leo stared at the screen, baffled by this level of compulsive organization. Fine, he typed, he would leave it for them shortly. After hearing no movement in the hall, Chloe asked why they were being so pathetic. "Because we're poor," Leo replied. He quickly hand-washed the stranger's shirt, fuming at the inconvenience. As he worked, Chloe asked if he was free on Saturday night. Olivia, their old classmate, was back in town and wanted to have dinner. They agreed to meet at a Japanese restaurant. He hung the neighbor's clothes to dry and, once sure the coast was clear, crept out and left the neatly folded, still damp clothes in a bag on the neighbor's doormat. Back inside, he spent 5 minutes hunched at the peephole, determined to finally see his tormentor. The door opposite creaked open. The figure emerged, head down, picking up the bag. All Leo could see was a shock of dark, spiky hair. The person was slender and, shockingly, not tall at all, maybe 5'7". Before he could get a look at the face, the door slammed shut. Leo was left staring, more confused than ever. Who was this short man wearing a giant's shirt? The dinner with Olivia was a mix of nostalgia and a stark reminder of their different paths. Olivia was a successful investment banker, already complaining about burnout and hypertension at 26. They reminisced about college, their conversation inevitably turning to disastrous past relationships. Olivia recounted her dramatic breakup with a campus heartthrob. Leo, not to be outdone, shared the story of his high school sweetheart, Ethan. He had followed Ethan to this university, only for Ethan to announce, after Leo had already accepted his offer, that he was going to school in the US instead. He had known for months but hadn't told Leo to avoid a fight. And then, Olivia asked. Leo explained that Ethan had gotten engaged to a tech mogul's daughter while abroad, and he had only found out right before the wedding. Olivia threw up her hands in surrender. You win. As they were laughing over their shared romantic foolishness, Chloe suddenly nudged him. Isn't that the math professor? She whispered. Leo looked over. It was Julian, dressed in his usual sharp suit. Across from him sat a handsome, well-built young man. They were laughing, looking comfortable and familiar. Then, the young man reached across the table and placed his hand on Julian's. Leo's world tilted. Was Julian already taken? Suddenly, the young man's head snapped around, his eyes locking directly onto Leo. His smile vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. He slammed his teacup down on the table, then, in a move straight out of a soap opera, picked it up and dashed the contents all over Julian. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the restaurant. Leo sat stunned for a moment, then turned to his friends. Does anyone have a wet wipe? Armed with a small packet from Chloe, he walked over to Julian's table. Professor? What a coincidence, he said smoothly. Do you need this? Julian took the wipe and cleaned his face and hands. His shirt was soaked, revealing the lean muscle underneath. He thanked Leo curtly. Leo, seizing the moment, sat down opposite him. I have a question, he said. Something that will keep me up all night if I don't figure it out. Julian gestured for him to continue. Leo leaned forward, his curiosity overwhelming him. Who was that? A friend, Julian said. He explained that his friend had a flair for the dramatic. Their conversation had drifted to people from the university, and Julian had mentioned seeing a student from campus. His friend had spotted Leo, and the rest was an impromptu, vengeful prank. He seems to think I owe him for something, Julian added dryly. Leo, relieved, laughed and said that for a moment, the scene had looked just like he trailed off, realizing it was inappropriate. Julian finished the sentence for him. A breakup scene. Leo agreed, adding that it was just a silly thought, what with them both being men. Julian looked at him directly. What if I told you I was gay? Leo leaned back so abruptly he almost fell off his chair. The world spun. The professor was gay. And he was coming out to him, a student he had only met 3 times. He managed to ask why Julian was telling him something so private. Julian asked if he had a problem with it. Of course not, Leo stammered, I am too. Felt only right to reciprocate. Julian's expression didn't change. He simply said, I thought you might be. That's why I told you. He explained that he needed to keep it quiet. His father didn't approve. It wasn't about him being gay, Julian clarified, but about the appearance of him not being gay to the outside world. This glimpse into the perfect professor's complicated family life made him seem more real. As Leo was processing all of this, he saw Olivia and Chloe staring at their table, whispering furiously. Julian noticed his glance and asked if he needed to get back to his friends. Reluctantly, Leo stood up and returned to his table, greeted by Olivia's piercing gaze. Well done, she said, full of admiration. I didn't know you had it in you. You've already got a professor wrapped around your finger. Leo protested that it was nothing like that, but as he recounted the conversation, a new theory began to form. He looked at his friends. Wait a minute, he said slowly, he told me, a practical stranger, his biggest secret. Do you think he might be interested in me? Chloe and Olivia exchanged a look that screamed delusional. But Leo was adamant. It was the only logical explanation. His path forward, once a dead end, now seemed wide open. He had been out of the game for years, but he was ready to try again. "I think I have a shot," he said, a determined glint in his eye. As they talked, the conversation drifted back to college memories. Olivia brought up a time Leo had gotten drunk during a study abroad program. Chloe interjected, asking if he remembered what happened that night. The question hit a nerve. Leo's hands clenched. "Other than that time," he said through gritted teeth. Olivia asked what had happened. He spit the words out. "Some bastard stole $700 from me." The memory still stung. $700 was more than a month's income. "If I ever find him," Leo vowed, "I'll kill him."